What's up, guys? In today's episode we are going to be making a tool for a game. So essentially we have ScriptableObjects and we want a tool to help us make them. And what this tool is going to do is basically just be a window, and then it's going to have information there, and then when we hit the create button it's going to automatically sort it into the folder it belongs to. Alright, so my tutorial assumes that you've been following alongside my other tutorials, because this exists inside of this game world. However, you don't need to have followed along, but we will be using my item system in order to create the assets. So in my item scriptable object, you can just copy basically just this. You just copy this. You'll be up to speed, and if you want to go a little bit more into it, you can create a weapon or an armor type, and basically the weapon and armor type just all it does is derive from the base item class. So you don't need that much to get started. And with all that being said, let's get started with the actual coding process. Alright, so we're going to create a C# script and call this base editor. And so this is going to be our base class that we'll be using to create our windows. And so this will help us create other editors too. And so first things first, we are going to be deriving from editor window, and it's not going to like that because we're missing the editor class. So we're going to hit Alt Enter, and then we're going to be saying using Unity Editor, so hit Enter again, and then it will like that now. So to show you the very basics of this first, I'm just going to create a public static void and call this show window. And then I am going to say menu item. And then we're going to say window/test. And then we're going to get the window. And then we need to throw in the class name, so base editor. And that's it. So with just this, we can get a window to pop up. So we're going to wait for it to compile first. Then we're going to the window, and then we have our test here. When we open the test, all we get is a window. And so in the future, we're going to, oops, didn't want me to dock that. In the future, or like in this tutorial, I should say, we're going to be adding all of the information that you'd normally get when we create like a weapon or something. See all this? The name, description, icon, whatnot. We're gonna be taking all this information, putting it here, and then adding a create button. And you'll be able to do this with any scriptable object. So let's close that, and let's get rid of this. So now that you know how that works, let's actually get started with the base editor. Alright, so before we even get started with the base editor, because it's the base editor, we're not going to be actually having a window for this. This is just to help us make windows. So in order to test, we need to create another script that derives from this script, so that we can actually have a window and see if our changes actually did anything. So we're going to create another C# script, and we'll just call this weapon editor. And in our weapon editor, we're just going to open that up, get rid of all that, and we're just going to derive from base editor. We're going to be doing the same thing where we're going to do the show window, public void, or public static void, show window, no, show window, and then we're going to do menu item, but it's not going to like that because we're missing the Unity editor reference. So hit Alt Enter and say using Unity editor, hit Enter again, and it'll like that. But in our case, we're not gonna be using the window, or our menu is not gonna be in the window menu. Let's create our own menu. Let's say you have your own company name or something like that. We'll think of a studio. Let's say DevBird, and then we'll hit slash, and then we'll call this weapon editor. And then when we click on this, we're going to get the window, and then we need to throw in the class name, weapon editor, and then we are done with that. So let's wait for it to compile. And as you see here, we have a little menu called DevBird, and when we click it, we get our weapon editor, and wow, we have our own weapon editor. So if you're working with a bunch of people, they can just go to your little menu and access all of the things you can create, and that can help speed up the game development process. Or if it's even just you can have this, and it's just nice to have. And so let's go back and let us now edit some of the information on our window. So here in our base editor, because weapon editor derives from base editor, anything we do in here, this will pretty much access it. Alright, so in our base editor, we are going to create a method. We'll call it a public because we're going to be accessing it in the weapon editor. Public draw GUI. Oops. And in here we are simply going to say GUI layout, and we're trying to create a title that's going to pop up in the window. It's going to let us know what kind of asset we're creating, essentially. So let's say GUI dot label, and essentially we need to get the type here, the weapon editor. So we're trying to get just the name weapon from the type. But for now, this pretty much just takes in a string and then a style. So I don't think you have to put a style in. Let's find out. If I just put a string in here, it will like that. So let's say test 1, 2, 3, and then we're gonna call this in this script. And basically what we have to do, you have to say, call this a private because we're not calling it anywhere else. Private void on GUI, and see we have a special method here. Make sure that it's blue, because, or whatever color scheme you're using, but make sure it's not just white, or else you're not using the special method that gets called whenever you open up the window. So whenever we open up the GUI, this code is going to get called, and so whenever we open up the window, we want to draw the GUI that we have here. So update the information on there. So let's say draw GUI. So this is the method we just created here, and hopefully with that, when this compiles, when we open up the window, we're gonna get a little label that pops up here. This is test 1, 2, 3. And so it's just a little text. Let's see if we can make that look a little bit better. So we're going to go back to our base editor, and we're going to, let's say first we want to center it, and let's say we want to make it bold. So in order to make it bold, we're just going to add a comma. We're going to say editor styles, and then we're just going to say bold label. And so that will bold it, but how about getting it to be centered? You say GUI layout dot begin horizontal. Oops. And then we say GUI layout end horizontal. And then after we do the begin horizontal and horizontal, we also have to do GUI layout dot flexible space, and then we're going to copy this, and then we're going to, well, actually just hit faster way of doing this, hit Control D to duplicate it, then hit hold on to Alt, and then hit down to move it down. And so we're going to have a begin horizontal, and then a flexible space, and then we're going to have our label here, and then flexible space, and end horizontal. So let's go over to our weapon editor after it compiles there, and then we're going to go here, and we see now that it is centered, it is bold, and now we can add some more information down here. And this is just so that the tester knows that we are in the weapon editor, or maybe you want to have some label here, whatever you want it to be, just so that it looks a little fancy. But obviously we don't want to have test 1, 2, 3, so how do we make sure that whatever window, and we also don't want to like have to manually set this. I mean, we can, but it's a little tedious. We want this to be automatic, so how do we get a proper name, let's say? Well, as long as we name our editors like this, something like weapon editor, or like consumable editor, we can use this name and just get rid of the word editor, and that can be our title. So how do we get that data? So we can get that data in our base editor. We don't have to go anywhere else but in here. And so let's create the method in order to get it. So we're trying to get a string, so we're going to create a private string and call this get data type. Oops. And so we're going to assign, let's say, create a variable, an empty variable, and this variable is going to store the name of the label that we want, and then we're going to return this variable. So we're going to call this variable, let's say, data name, data type. Let's just call it data type. It doesn't really matter. And you say equals, and say get type, then dot toString, and then we're going to replace the word editor with an empty string. So we're pretty much getting rid of the word editor in here, and then just deleting it. And then we're going to return that data type, and that's it for that. And so instead of saying test 1, 2, 3, instead we can just call the method getDataType, and it is going to just have the name of the class. But weapon is probably, not very descriptive. Let's just call it weapon creator. So we're going to say plus, and then add a space, and then call it creator. And let's add a little exclamation point just for some pizzazz. And so when it compiles, we have weapon creator. And so whenever we create a new editor, let's say consumable editor, quest editor, dialog editor, it's going to automatically update it and we'll have the proper name. But if you don't want that, you can just have whatever name you want and just get rid of that. And need to have the word editor in here or else you're going to get an error because it's looking for the word editor. So make sure you name everything properly, unless you want some errors in your code. Alright, so let's get into the next exciting thing that we can do, and that's creating a button. So we're creating a button that will essentially create our asset, but you can have buttons for multiple things within the editor, not just for creating the actual asset. The button can do anything you want. Let's say you want a button in your window that generates stats, or maybe a button that generates a random name, or I don't know what else there is, but you have a lot of different buttons in your window that do whatever you want them to do. So that's exciting. So let's see how we can create this button. We pretty much just say if, nope, that's not what I want. If GUI layout dot button, and this is where we create the button name, and let's say it's called, well, this will be the button that creates the item. So let's say create, and let's say plus, and then we already have this get data type conveniently here for us. So we just say get data type, and then we have to create the width for like the size of the button. I think I'm not in the correct parentheses here. So go over one, hit comma, and then you can say GUI layout. Actually, I think I was in the right one. Comma, GUI layout, yeah. So you'll make sure that there's 2 parentheses to the right of this thing. Just make sure you, get you're in the right place. So GUI layout max width dot max width can be something like 200. So there's a lot of parentheses. Make sure you have the correct amount. And with all that, before we even make it do anything, we're going to see if the button appears. And it does. We have a little button here, and if, we're missing a space. So hit space after create, and that should fix that. And we want to have it be centered, right? And we already know how to do that. We just need to copy this. So begin horizontal, then flexible space. Have at the top, and then add the flexible space and horizontal. Copy that. Add at the bottom. So you want to center something, you have to add this begin horizontal space, flexible space, and then another flexible space, and end horizontal. It's a little tedious, but that's just how this works. And it will center. There you go. And so we have weapon creator, and we have a create weapon, and we click it, it does nothing, but we can click it. And then now we need to add some functionality to this. Well, actually first we need to add the information of the weapon. And then we can hit create, because if you just hit create, it's just going to create an empty asset, and it's not really that interesting. Alright, so we have our little weapon editor, but no information is popping up. So how do we get the information from our weapon onto our window? Or just any information from the scriptable object onto our window. In order to do that, we need to create a temporary piece of data. So let's call it ScriptableObject, and we'll call this data. And we can make it private, since we're only using in this script. Let's call it something like asset data, just so that's a little more clear. And so we're just taking the asset data, and we're going to take that information and displaying it on the screen. So first we need to somehow get the scriptable object data. We need to call it in our draw GUI, and we need to pass this information over to our weapon editor over here, so it knows what to draw. But how do we do that exactly? Well, we want to get the weapon class and put it in here. Well, how do we do that? Or just any scriptable object class and put it in here. We can use that. We can do that with the power of generics. So we're going to say draw GUI, and then we're going to create a little less than and open, or less than greater than symbol. And between that, we're going to say T. And so this is just the generic type here. And we need to define what T is. And so what T is, and we say where T is a scriptable object. So pretty much the reason why we're doing this, we're trying to pass through a type, a generic type, and we're trying to make sure that the game knows, or the code knows that it's a scriptable object, or it's expecting a scriptable object. And so over here, it's going to give us an error because it's like, hey, you need to declare what T is. And so in order to do that, we just do the same thing, create the little less than, greater than symbol, and it's giving us a question mark, like what is T? And in this case, we want T to be our weapon. And so what you're throwing in here basically is the information you want to display on the screen. And so if we go back to our weapon editor, our weapon class, well, this is empty, but it derives from item. So let's go over to item. And so here, it's going to display all this information. Every exposed public type here is going to expose the name, the description, the icon, the max text size. So you're trying to target whatever class you're trying to expose. So let's close that. And we're trying to expose the weapon class. So we want all that information in the weapon class to display on our screen. But so far we just gotten information. We haven't displayed anything. We haven't done anything yet in the draw GUI. And so in order to do that, we are going to simply say if asset data is null. So this is just to make sure that there is actually something on there. So if the asset data actually exists, which it should, then we're going to say asset data is equal to create instance, and we're going to say t. So why are we doing this? Basically, the way it works, I'm going to create a little paint, is that we're going to be making a piece of data here. That's pretty poorly written. We're making a piece of data with information on it. And this information, we're going to be assigning it to the actual physical asset data in our project. So like our piece of armor, this is the physical piece of serialized data that we have here. But we're creating, I'm just going to go back over to here. We're creating a piece of data behind the scenes. So this, you're not going to be able to see this, where this is or what it is. So we're creating an instance of the data with all the information on it. And then later on, we're going to use this information, and we're going to be assigning it to the physical piece of asset data that we see here. So we haven't gotten to that part yet, but that's just the reason why we're doing this. So we've created the instance that's going to be in the that's going to be basically behind the scenes. So we're not going to be able to see what this is, but it's there. So we created the instance, and now what we need to do, we're going to create a variable, call it editor. We're going to say equals editor dot create editor, and then we're going to pass in the data, the asset data, and then finally we're going to say if our editor is not equal to null, so just make sure that it exists. Editor dot on inspector GUI, we're going to call it. So this ensures that we display the information on our window. And so let's give it a little bit of time to compile. And now, just like that, we have all of the types exposed here. We have the strings, we have the sprites, we have our integer, and then we have our enumerator. And I can type in here and assign all this information and all that good stuff. But our create weapon still does nothing. And so now the next part is trying to get our information here and creating a asset, and no, not that one, in creating an asset and then assigning this information here, putting it onto here, and then sorting it into the proper folder. That is the next step. Alright, so we have our script here, our base editor, and we basically want to create an empty asset, or an empty scriptable object. And in order to do so, we're going to create a method that is just going to create an empty asset, and we're going to put it in our asset file or folder. So let's create a private, because we're only going to be using it here, and it's going to return a type scriptable object, and we'll call this create asset. And this create asset is going to need a generic type. So we're gonna do the same thing over here where we said draw GUI generic type T. So we're just going to add the T for type, and then we're going to add the parentheses, and then we're going to say where T is a scriptable object. So here we're going to now create a asset. So this is the type, and this is the just the name that we're calling this, the asset, the word asset. It could be any word. This is the name that we're giving it, and it's going to create instance of type T. And we're doing the same thing over here, just down here. And T is the type, it's a generic type, so imagine this could be like the weapon. And so we're basically saying, oh, hey, we have a weapon asset, and we're going to create a weapon instance of it, or instance of that weapon type. And we're going to store it into this variable here. That's all it is. And so now that we've created this variable, we're going to return this variable, but first we need to use this in order to create the asset itself. So what we're going to do now is we're going to need to set the path for this asset. And whenever you're making paths, or whenever you're accessing files within your Unity project, or any project really, you're going to be wanting to be using system.io. So we're going to be using system.io just for future purposes. I'll be using very soon. And system.io just lets you move files around, and that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be creating our asset, and then we're going to be sticking it in our asset folder. So first we need to get the path, and we're just going to say string, and we'll call this asset path is equal to, we're going to say asset database. And we're going to say generate unique asset path. And then we're going to put this in the assets. And then we'll say new space. And then we're going to say plus type of T. And we're going to make that toString, and then we're going to declare it as an asset file. So we are putting in the asset folder here. So this folder, the assets, so it's just going to be like hanging out outside. And then we get the type of the generic that we declare, the generic type that we declare. So in this case, it's going to be the weapon class here. So it's going to say new, and then we're going to convert that type into a string. So it's going to say new weapon, and then we declare it as an asset. So now that we have the path name, we are going to now officially create our asset. So we're going to say asset database, asset database dot create asset. And here it's going to want a scriptable object, or just an object. In our case, we have a scriptable object, and then it's going to want the path. And so we've done both of these things right now. we have the scriptable object, and then we just created the path that we want it to be in. So all we have to do now is put those two things in. So the asset, and then the asset path, and then we just have to return the asset, and we're good to go. So the reason why we are returning this asset is because later on we're going to be needing it to get the values and whatnot and set the values. But for now, it doesn't really matter that much. So we're just going to call this method the createAsset method. And we're going to throw in t, and that's all that needs. And so after this compiles, when we hit create weapon, you see it just created a new weapon here. Now if I keep clicking it, it's just going to keep creating new weapons, and that's how you create a new asset. And so now all it does is just create a blank empty weapon, and it just sticks it in our asset folder. So not very helpful, but we're getting there. So what do we need to do next now? The last thing we need to do, well actually no, there's two more things we need to do. I guess the most important thing we need to do is get this data here and set it to the data here. And then the next and final step is to sort it into the correct folder. And so let me show you how we can do that. Alright, so the next part is getting this information in our weapon creator, and we need to get it onto our weapon. Well, how do we do that? The solution might not be as simple as you think it is. So imagine if we have our scriptable object here, and we're trying to transfer all the data onto it onto another scriptable object. The problem lies where this could be like a weapon, and then this could be over here, could be something else. Let's say it's a potion. Well, obviously the stats on a weapon isn't the same as a potion, so this wouldn't work. And so we have to manually go through all of the variables and make it equal to the variables here. And so we go back. We couldn't do it in our generic base editor because it just wouldn't make sense to have the weapon stats and set it manually in here. It makes sense to do it in our weapon editor. However, there's a lot of overlap between weapons and potions, right? What do they have in common? They have the name. They both have a name, they both have a description, stuff like that. Because they both go over to our inventory, item types. They both derive from the item class. And so everything in the item class, they're both going to have. And so we can set up everything in here in a different editor, because we're using this base editor for things like dialogue, quest, stuff like that, so we don't want to set that up in here. And so we're going to need a base item editor. We're just call it item editor. So we're going to have to create a new script in our editor scripts, and we're going to call this item editor. And in here, we're going to set up all of that stuff, all of the stats and whatnot, and make it equal to the stats of the object that we just created, or the asset that we just created. And so this is going to derive from base editor, and our weapon editor is going to derive from our item editor. And so you can think of it as like we have our base editor here, and it's going to have, or being derived from, like let's say this is a quest editor. I'll just type it in, quest editor. We have another one. Let's say this is the one we're currently using, called the item editor. And then this one could be the dialog editor. And then our item editor is going to be derived from a bunch of different classes. And this one could be like the weapon editor here, and this could be like a potion editor, this could be like a quest item editor. And so you see how the hierarchy works, and this would have like a bunch of different ones too. And so right now we're focusing on the item editor. So in our item editor, we need to create another script, or not another script. We need to create a method here where it's going to be a empty method with nothing in it, and we're going to call this we're going to make it a public because we're going to be using in other scripts virtual void. We'll call this set stats. Alright, so what's this virtual business going on here? Basically, the virtual lets us override this method. And what that means is that I can now go into here, and so in my item editor I can say public override, and then when I hit space, it's going to give you a list of things that you can override. Well, here's the virtual method that we just made, and it appears in this list because it was marked virtual. So we can double click this, we're going to just like type it out, and it's going to give us this base set stats. And what this means for us is that it's going to call, if we have this base set stats, it's going to call whatever code is inside of here. If we don't include it, then it's not going to call any code inside of the original set stats. Alright, so the next part is that we need to actually call this code. So we don't need anything inside of here just yet. I don't even think we even need anything inside here, like, ever. Because we're not going to be setting anything inside of this method. And so we can call this method in our create, when we create the item. So when we create any item, it's going to call this method here. And so what do we want to do exactly in our item editor? So what are we trying to do here? We need to access two things. We need to access first the instance that we create, so the actual weapon that we create, and then we need to access the data in our weapon creator, and then we simply need to go through and set up all these individual variables manually. Alright, so we can do that. So the reason why we have this method here is because now, remember that this method returns a scriptable object. Returns the scriptable object that we create. Alright? So when I hit create weapon, this thing here, this object, or this asset right here, this method will return that specific asset. So that's really important. So we're just going to create a reference to it, scriptable object, and we'll call this, we'll just call this SO. And so now we have a reference to that, and we can pass it through this method here, set stats. And so we need to create two scriptable objects. objects, we'll call this the asset data, and another scriptable object. We'll call this the asset itself. So I'm just going to change this name to asset. And so now we know that this is in reference to the asset, and then this up here is in reference to the data for the asset, just so that you don't get mixed up. And so now we can pass through the asset data, and then we need to pass through the asset. And so now with that, we now have a reference to the data for the asset and the asset itself. Now when we go into our item editor, we can now utilize those two things. Alright, now, so we're getting an error here because it wants us to pass through the parameters. Well, we're just going to delete it and rewrite it, and it'll do it for us automatically. So say public override, and then we're going to go down to set stats over here, double click that. And now it just does it automatically for us. And so we don't really need the base. It's not going to do anything. Whether you have this or not, it's not going to do anything for our specific example. So we can just cross that out, or just delete it, doesn't matter. Yeah, let's just delete it, we don't need it. Maybe we'll need it later on. But okay, so now we can set this up so that we know that because we're in the item editor, we know that the assets that we're getting, or the scriptable objects that we're getting, are both going to be deriving from our, are both going to be items, basically. So if we know that they're items, then we can convert them to items so they can use them as an item. And that sounds a little complicated, but I'll show you what I mean. Alright, so what we're going to do here is we're going to say item, we'll call this item data is equal to asset data as an item. And then we're going to do the same thing for the other asset here. Is we're going to say item, we'll call this new item, is equal to asset as an item, because we know that they're both going to be items. And now we can just go through the information on the item. So let's go and look at it real quick. Inventory, item types, item. So we're going to go through the name, the description, the icon, the max stack size, the quality, and that should be it. So gotta make sure we get through all of those. And so gotta remember which one is the asset and which one is the data. Because if you set the assets data to the item data, that doesn't make any sense. It's gonna be the wrong way around. We're gonna be making the data here on the new weapon they've created onto our editor, which we don't want to do. So make sure that you're going the right way. And we do that by having good naming conventions. So I know that this is the data because I have the word data on it. And so, okay. So we're trying to make the new item, the information on the item, equal to the information on the data. Alright? So let's go through the first one. Is the name. So go through my name is equal to item data dot my name. Alright, so I'm just going to check if this works first before I move on, because this would be a waste of time if it didn't work. Just want to show you that it works. So I'm going to go over, and the name should save when we'll call this Blade of Hurting. And I hit create weapon, and then the new item here is called Blade of Hurting. So you see it works here. And I'm just going to go and set all this up real quick, fast forward so you don't have to sit through it. Alright, so I have all of the information on the item and I've set it all up, so it should 100% work. So let's call this Sword of Healing, and the description will be like, I am a sword. The text or my icon will be this thing, and you can have 5 of these and it's a legendary. So we're going to create it, and you see that it all saves and it all works, whatnot. And we can create a new thing here, and it's gonna create a new one. And so let's see, next thing is, well, what about the information here? Well, we don't really want this to stay. How about when we hit create item or create a new weapon, all this information goes away? That's pretty simple to do. So all we have to do, well, we could either manually go through and set all this information to be blank or null. That's pretty inefficient, and it's going to take a lot of time to do, and you have to do that for every type of and you basically would have to do that for every item or like dialogue, whatever, and so that could take a long time. What's an easier way to do this? Well, we can simply just take this asset data equals create instance, and we can just create a new instance. And so basically what will happen is it's going to create a new instance whenever we create weapon, and which means that all the information on it is going to go away. So I'm going to hit create weapon, and you see that? All this information just goes away. So I now have a bunch of stuff here that I don't want. Alright, so what can we do next? We still need to actually ping the object, and that's super simple to do, so I'm just going to do that in like 2 seconds. We're just going to go down here, we're going to type in editor GUI utility, and then ping object, and then we're just going to throw in the asset that we just created. And so all it's going to do is going to highlight it. We hit create weapon, and then just pings it. And so this might not look fancy, but let's say I'm in the a different folder or something, and so I want to be taken directly to the correct folder whenever I hit create weapon. And so by pinging it, it's going to direct me straight to whatever folder it's in. That's pretty handy. And so the very last thing we need to do is we need to set up the folders so that we can automatically sort this weapon into its correct folder. So we can do that all in here. Alright, so we have our weapon creator and we get the stats, but how do we sort it into the correct folder? So what we're going to want to do is we're going to have a folder specifically for scriptable objects, and then we're going to have subfolders for the type that it is. So you can imagine it's just like a generic folder, and within that folder we'll have like a weapons folder, a consumable folder, etc. So that way things will be neat and organized, and you'll be able to find where all your weapons are and where all your consumables are. So how do we do that? Well, we need to go to where we actually set the path. And down here, conveniently enough, we generate a unique asset path here. So this is where we're putting the asset itself, and we just need to change this to be the place where we want it to be. But first, how do we create folders, and how do we make it so that if the folder doesn't exist, it'll create the folder for us? That way, we don't have to manually go in and create a folder every time we want to have a new type. Like, let's say we have a new type like quest items. Well, we don't want to go in, create a folder called quest items, and then have to set it all up. And then what if like you get a letter wrong, and then it doesn't match up correctly, and it's going to give you an error, and it's just like prone to a lot of errors. So we want to automate all of this so that we don't have to worry about it ever again. So the first thing I said was we need to check if the file path exists, and if it doesn't exist, we need to create it. So we're going to create a method to do that. So we're going to say private, because we don't need to use this in any other script. String. So we're going to return a string, and then we're going to check path. And then we are going to pass through a string as a parameter. We'll just call this path. And essentially what we're going to do next is we are going to check if the path that we pass through, if that exists or not. So let's check if it exists, and if it let's check if it doesn't exist, because we want to do something if it doesn't exist. If it does exist, then you know, that's perfect. We don't need to do anything. So if it doesn't exist, we're going to say asset database dot is valid folder, and then we're going to pass through the path. And then we are going to say directory dot folder. Oops, not folder. Create directory. And then we're going to say path. And then we're going to return the path. And that ought to do it. Alright, so let's see here. If the path exists, or doesn't exist, we're going to create that path, and then we're just going to return the path. And so now we can go over here, and we can create the path that we want. So we're going to say something like, so let's create the path first. So it's going to be a string, and we'll call this path is equal to, let's say assets. So we know we want it to be in the assets, of course. Let's say we're going to make a folder called ScriptableObjects, and inside that folder we are going to add things like weapons and whatnot, but we'll do that in here. So actually no, we can do it here. That's fine. So we are going to say plus, and then we are going to say we're going to get the data type. So we have a handy little method, or method, a string, that returns the data type. This is pretty much just the type without the word editor in here. So in this case, for our weapons, it's going to return this weapon editor. It's going to remove the word editor, and it's just going to give us weapon. And so it's going to create a folder called assets ScriptableObjects, and in this case, weapon. And then we need to add another slash. And then after that, we can finally add the what's it called? The item. The item's name, that is. So we can get rid of this. And then we're going to say check path. And we're going to throw in our path. And that should do it. So we don't want to add the this part to our path because we don't want to check if the item's there or not. We just want to know up until the part where we get to the asset. So we're just checking the folder path. So this is just the folder path. And then we're going to check the folder path, and it's going to return. And let's see how that works. Just going to double check it. Yep, that ought to work. So make sure it's compiled. Hit create weapon, and then boom. So you see, before we didn't have this. We didn't have ScriptableObjects. We didn't have weapon folder, but now we do. Now we have weapon. But I deleted my new part, so let me just add that in real quick. New space plus. And this is just so that it says new weapon, just because that's what just so I know that it's a new weapon. But we're going to change that too to be the name of the item later on. And that works. Alright, so the last thing that we're probably going to do here is we are going to rename this new weapon into something more applicable. So what we need to do is we need to create a public string, and call this my name. And we will be personally naming this item or this asset in the creator here, so that when we create it, that's the name it's going to be. Now you might be thinking, well, why can't we just use my name here, right? We have a my name here. Let's just use that. Actually, I should call this asset name now that I see that we already have a my name. So we're going to say asset name, and then we can't use this because what if the type that we're trying to create is like a dialogue? Well, dialogues don't have names to them, so we basically have to have a special string to store that information. So we have this string here called asset name, but it's not popping up. In order to get it to pop up, we need to draw it in the draw GUI. And so it's pretty simple. We're just going to say asset name is equal to editor GUI layout dot, and then we want this to be a text field, and it's going to want two strings basically. We're going to have string 1 and then the asset name to return to it, and it will like that. And so here, this is going to be like the little tooltip to help you know what you're actually naming. So we're going to say, call this asset name. And now if we go back and wait for compile, we have an asset name here. Wow. And so we can type here, and this will be our asset, the name of the asset, and all editors will have this asset name thing specifically. So we can like center this if we want to show that it's a little bit special. And so we already know how to center things. We just take this, begin, horizontal, flexible space, all that, take this, put that there, and that's not it, get rid of that, okay. And so when it compiles, it will now be centered, but because we don't have that much space, it kind of looks weird. But that will do for now. You can just call this name, so it's a bit more space. And so, alright, we have the name of the asset stored here. And so how can we use that over here? Well, instead of doing this, saying new type of string.asset, we can just get rid of all of this and then just put in asset name. Let that all compile. And we can say let's call it a sword. Let me create it. There you go, we have a sword. And so that's how you can have a specific name for whatever asset you're creating. Alright, so the very last thing that I will show you for this tutorial, later on we can do some better formatting, have this look way better. But for now, this is like the basic functionality. Just to show you something, let's say you have something in your weapons. Let's go over to our weapon script. And let's create a public integer and call this power. We'll probably get rid of this later. This is just for example. And so now you'll see that we have a power here, but if I set it, the power does not get set. It's at 0. Oops. So how can we set this power, right? Well, we go over to our item editor and then we type in how we did everything else. We type in new item and we try to go to power, but power is not here because our item itself does not have power on it, because this just means generic items. So how do we get access to the weapon? And we don't want to put it in here because what if we have a potion? You know, potion doesn't have power. Maybe it does, but in our case it doesn't. And so there's going to be a mismatch. Well, we can put it over where we create over in our weapon editor, because our weapon editor, well, obviously it's going to be a weapon for sure, 100%. Our weapon editor cannot generate anything that's not weapons, so this is pretty safe to do. Well, like I said before, we can override methods. So we say public override set stats. And it's important to call the base set stats because we want to call all of this code here. So make sure you have the base set stats. And then in here, we can do the exact same thing, where we do this, but instead of as an item, we can do it as a weapon. So we just change all the items to weapons. And the reason why we can do this, because as I said, we are in the weapon editor, and the weapon editor can only generate weapons. And so now we can say new item dot, we can go access that power now, and then the item data, and set it to the power. So now, when I set all this information here, you know, we'll create a real one. Let's call this axe hurt. And let's say the power is 9,000. When we create this weapon, we go over to our axe, and now we see that the power is correctly set, and all the other information is all intact. And that's it for this video, and you can just go through the same process that I did with the weapon editor with all the other types, like your dialogue and whatnot. Your potions, just go through the same process, and you can have a bunch of different editors, and if you're working a project with a team, they'll probably appreciate this very much. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you guys next time. I'd like to thank my Patreons Alejandro, Kovian, Bay, Emerson, Kirijo, Polybius, and Yoan. If you want to become a Patreon, you can support me at patreon.com/devbird, where you can join my Discord, or you can just join the Discord, the link description below. And you can suggest videos or ask me questions, and I'll see you guys next time.